Good evening, everyone. Today I'm speaking to Mathew Ehret. He's a journalist based in Canada, and he wrote a very interesting piece for Unlimited Hangouts on the Club of Rome and the rise of the predictive modeling mafia. So, Mathew, welcome to this channel.
Hey, Hugo. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, so you wrote in this article a very depressing and yet fascinating tale. For the listeners, can you please give an introduction to what is the Club of Rome? Let's start there.
That's a perfectly good place to start. Yeah. The Club of Rome is an organization that was set up in the late 1960s, nominally under the rubric of leadership of a fellow named Sir Alexander King, who was formerly a very high-level official within the OECD Science Directorate, and another fellow named Aurelio Peccei, who had a certain amount of authority within Volkswagen and a few other Fiat agencies in the 1960s. Now, the organization around which that became known as the Club of Rome, their original meeting was set up at an estate owned by David Rockefeller. Rockefeller himself, for all of the things that could be said about him, one of the things that he was engaged in at the time was spearheading a new type of organization that was designed to take over the functions of pretty much every aspect of governance of the United States. And that came to be known as the Trilateral Commission.
Okay, and they're still in existence today. You know, and we're talking about organizations and structures that exist to this very day. Whether they have full control, that's another question. Probably not as much as some people think, but also they are still influential, right?
Yeah, they're agencies of influence. Nothing is. I have a problem with those who wish to find a singular smoking gun boogeyman to explain away all of their problems, and people will often latch on to one or another agency. And I don't think it's right to dismiss them as being unimportant, because a lot of the corruption that has befallen our society over the last several generations could not have happened had it not been for these agencies. But it isn't just any one or the other. They obviously have certain jurisdictions, certain roles to play at advancing an agenda, pushing influence. But to say that one is the cause of your problems is really, you're going to sell yourself short, and you won't really see the big picture. But this is a good example. It's a very good example. The head of the Fiat corporation or complex at that time, which is known as sort of an automotive industry, was also a leading figure of the Trilateral Commission, a founding member. David Rockefeller was with Zbigniew Brzezinski, a young up-and-comer.
I wrote an article on Brzezinski recently. Yep. Yeah, very interesting character.
Yeah. So these are James Schlesinger as well. Henry Kissinger was a big controller, nominally an enemy in some ways of Zbigniew. But when you look at how controlled opposition often works, disputes are created that don't actually have meaning for those who are on the inside in the know. Now, one of the aspects of this philosophically was to revive a way of, or to bring back a way of thinking into the dominant policy-making structures within the Western governments that would be targeted, especially the United States. That ideological way of thinking for the governing class would be known as Malthusianism, or a neo-Malthusianism. That's
Malthusianism, Thomas Malthus being the economist, one of the three economists, Malthus, Ricardo, and Adam Smith, basically three founders of economics. And just for the listeners, Malthus was the guy who said the world's going to be overpopulated, especially organic societies is going to be overpopulated. And he was disproven, I think, by history, correct? But it seems that this thing doesn't die.
No, bad ideas, unfortunately, they got big claws. and evidence, when you're dealing with religions, oftentimes, or religious type of argumentation, evidence doesn't really play that powerful of a role if it contradicts a doctrine, a creed. And certainly when you're dealing with imperialists, either today or in the late 18th century, when Malthus was writing and receiving his pay and support by the British East India Company as a nominal parson, a man of the church, but at the same measure, he was a grand strategist who put forth a certain way of thinking about mathematical controls of populations of the earth. It's not really a matter of evidence it's more a religious thing, because these people religiously believe every generation in the idea of a Hobbesian way of thinking about governing a society around a master-slave dichotomy. And those born into positions of power, they will do some mental gymnastics, promote some pseudoscientific gullibaloo that tries to say, well, they're there because, and born into such privilege because they are genetically or other superior to those born into the weak, inferior classes who are slaves.
So it's the elites trying to adopt it, or the elites adopting an ideology to justify their position, as opposed to saying it's just a chance of your birth, or just the fact that you happen to be born in a rich family as opposed to chance of birth, or you were lucky, they inherited money.
Yeah.
They're trying to say because we are special. I think in the past it was skin color. Today it's increasingly more wealth, and it's this theory that the rich are the creators of wealth and adoption, and sort of that's the line of thinking, I suppose, that falls into this as well.
Yeah, it's, I guess, this perverse idea of trickle-down economics. But yeah, rather than changing your way of being to conform to the data of the universe, which is what humans should, and that's what we do when we're at our best, is we're like, oh, okay, the universe is showing me my way of thinking, my way of doing things is wrong. I will change my way of doing things in conformity with this new discovery. And in so doing, I harmonize both myself as an individual, but also, if I'm able to, institutionalize or communicate my inner insight with the society more broadly through a new discovery, an invention, a way of improving the productive powers or the means of education, well, then I resonate more in tune with the laws of nature. And that's like great. Every time we do that, we tend to find certain effects as consequence. And you can do a study of history with this lens and look for all of those times where human society got their act together and acted this way. We overcame limits to growth. We were able to discover that certain things we didn't think were resources were actually usable resources. Like, for example, when you go from when you enter the Iron Age, that thing that seemed to be just a rock in the ground, all of a sudden you're like, oh, if we utilize this new technique of utilizing a design for furnaces, other forms of processing, well, this rock becomes a useful ore for building more durable, strong structures, right? That's a simple example, but every time we make a discovery, we find that other parts of the periodic table we not just discover, but we find use for, and we are liberated from the limited resources that had formerly been what we were dependent upon in the state when we were ignorant of whatever the discovery was, right? Mm-hmm. So imperialists don't like this, because the way Hobbesian, zero-sum thinking always has managed to keep control of a system was by getting people, by monopolizing whatever people are using at any given moment in time, whether it's all of the wood in the kingdom or all of the coal in a kingdom or arable land. And by monopolizing it, you could increasingly not just extract wealth, you could manipulate the pricing of those goods by withholding the amount of whatever resource you allow into the market. That's been a way that rapacious...
Good example of that is the diamond, the price of diamonds. It's artificially low because of Cecil John Rhodes as De Beers monopoly. And I think every year, there's 2 weeks of a year where they actually just sell diamonds. They cut a lot, but they don't sell all they cut. So they control the supply. That artificially increases the price, right? So it's monopoly 101. And you're making the argument that this type of thinking goes much deeper than just a bunch of crony capitalists and robber barons. Yeah. It's actually become sort of, it was like an elite doctrine for controlling society, because these guys actually believe that they have the knowledge and they are omnipotent, omniscient. Yeah.
It does give one, it inflames the ego and the arrogance when you can wield that much power, and power can be a bit of a drunken thing if it's not tempered by a moral culture. If you don't have that love of wisdom, then if you're just a hedonist with a little bit too much power, then that could cause a lot of damage. And so one of the consequences was the discovery of price manipulation. And people like Thomas More, he went to battle with this logic in his Utopia. You could read his Utopia from this lens and look at what he's doing for, by targeting all of the different lords who are manipulating the sheep wool markets by doing exactly what I'm just saying. And you just gave a great example of Cecil Rhodes's innovation. They could make diamonds in laboratories, for Christ's sakes, and yet somehow, heroin, also another example as well. Like, when you actually appreciate how the global drug and narcotics markets are controlled,
it's the pricing.
It's depressing, and this is exactly what they're doing. Like the price of the heroin you buy on the market when you go to this. Well, I'm not talking like
you sound to be quite informed on the situation, yeah.
I said too much. No, but I mean, when the drug dealer is going to sell, that is very regulated from the top. And places like HSBC have been caught red-handed and have paid hundreds of millions of dollars to settle different cases when they've been found guilty of laundering heroin money. Royal Bank of Canada has purchased all of HSBC Canada's holdings as well.
We're going over a tangent with this question. I'm going to ask a little bit now, but it has to be asked to you guys who study deep politics. Somebody needs to investigate the link between the narcotics market, the illegal market, and the legal market. Because I quite believe that there is a very big link between illegal drugs and legal drugs. They're like, the same guys changing their color. Like the illegal alcohol trade used to be in the beginning of last century. I haven't seen anyone done a thorough analysis on it. I've read Peter Dale Scott's work on the narcotics trade, but something tells me that Pfizer, Moderna, and these guys have got some backdoor link to the guys going back all the way to Afghanistan.
I think you would find your hypothesis correct. Peter Dale Scott's work on the topic was very good. I've looked into a bit of that. I would also say doping. This is one of the best resources I've found. The 1986 edition of Dope Incorporated, the book that drove Henry Kissinger crazy, is extremely good. If people could find this online on Amazon or wherever you want to find it, buy it, study it. I mean, I've got several copies of this. It's good. It needs to be updated, though. That being said, back to our original thing, that price manipulation and crony capitalism is one aspect. The other aspect is getting people to fight over limited resources, diminishing returns, which is where David Ricardo sort of refined what was already being done as a matter of practice for centuries, if not millennia. David Ricardo innovated this idea of the diminishing rate of returns as an immutable law of economic systems. That there will always be.
Don't you find it astonishing, though, that the economists have played such an important role in thinking, in general, in policy thinking? It's as if they've gotten a really higher up level. I mean, it's in society, it's probably the most successful, if not the most successful form of social sciences.
It is. You can do more destruction with the stroke of a pen at the World Bank than you can with 100 paramilitary groups in Africa or anywhere else. Like you could. Yeah, I mean, there's been, I think, people talk about secrets known only to the inner elites and things of that sort, which gets a little Gnostic, occult, and mystified, I think. Because when you look at, yes, there are reserved ways of thinking and appreciating the manipulation of systems, especially human systems, which are reserved for those in the inner club, right? For those who are in the know, born into certain families of privilege and given certain experiences that involve grooming of the young to become upper level managers of the system. Because I mean, the problem with empire is always the same. It's always the same problem. How do you maintain continuity over many generations? That's challenge. You might get like a bunch of competent people at one time, but there's no guarantee that in 3-4 generations after that generation is dead, that competence will continue. And in fact, we usually tend to find that that's exactly the problem. What happens? Look at Bertrand Russell or H.G. Wells or a lot of the I mean, there's a whole variety. Leo Amory, even, Lord Milner. Look at the quality of mind that they exhibited in organizing reconstructions of science, of history, of philosophy. I mean, the amount of effort and mind power put into their productions is very high quality, despite the fact that it's a bunch of slanderous lies that don't really have bearing. But despite that, compare it to the modern coterie of Klaus Schwabians and figures who are expected to manage the ship of state. And even Schwab is going into his 80s. Look at the younger crowd who are like third, fourth.
We make the case that they are basically a managerial elite for the system of domination and control.
It's a managerial elite, but they're dumber. Like there's a certain reduction of, there's an increase of mediocrity even amongst those who are expected to be those who wield power in the system. of the governing class. Maybe on some level there's still trickles of competence of a higher magnitude, but I don't see that very much. I mean,
yeah, but there's been a hollow out of elites, not just elites, of competency in all the state institutions since. I mean, I suppose it's been a consequence of privatization as well. You know, it's more lucrative in the private sector. But what I find very interesting about this phenomenon, the Club of Rome and the World Economic Forum, and as you say, trilaterals, and not just your ordinary politicians for that matter, is the fact that it is not just government. You know, in the past, the critique was the government is incompetent. What you're actually finding here is that these corporate institutions, these think tanks, these multinationals seem to be ran by a bunch of morons. Okay, that have got very powerful, and we'll get into this maybe from following from this, computer models and methodologies at their disposal, but they obviously don't understand what they're applying.
No, not really. I mean, ultimately, you're trying to manipulate something in such a they're committing the greatest offense of science, which is to expect that the universe works according to your model. That's sort of what we were poking some holes at that or making fun of that a bit at the beginning.
I'm waiting for them to get a hang on artificial intelligence. That's just going to be, that's going to spiral the algorithm in another direction as well. We're seeing signs of that already.
That's a whole other conversation. Yeah, we can go there after. But yeah, no, I think, like we're talking about, so the Malthusian revival that was overseen by certain upper level managers, I think is a way to think about it, like David Rockefeller. Alexander King was very upper level management of the system. That was a revival of what Ricardo, Malthus, even Mill and his son were in various forms as agents of a certain imperial political interest. They were all agents of the British East India Company and the agencies of oligarchism as a force of control in the world. And the idea is always, how do you create a system, especially in a world where a love of freedom began to really become yearned and tasted in the late 18th century. The American Revolution had really electrified people's minds and imaginations around the world about what was possible. Maybe we're destined for something better than hereditary structures of power. Maybe we're capable of attaining self-governance, and the idea of the consent of the governed being a legitimate form and the best form of government. So this is something which you couldn't put that back in the bottle. You couldn't just crush it the way some sort of, inquisitional types might have wished, but you had to corrupt it. You had to give off a veneer of intellectualism to get people to willfully get back in the cage themselves. And so what better way to do it but then to make the cage seem like it's freedom? And so, the logic of certain assumptions of Malthus and of Ricardo were promoted as economic liberalism, that we could just adopt philosophical and economic policies of laissez-faire free trade of Adam Smith.
Yeah, it's feudalism disguised as freedom in a certain sense.
Yeah, exactly. And that way all of our guard was laid down, and the arsonists were free to come into our houses and light fires at that point, because no protectionism, you just let the markets be. And of course, in a world where the British East India Company, the City of London's central banking complex, is like actually running about exerting its influence, they want all of the nations to just sort of put your sentinels to sleep and come back in and take control. Now, again, as the consequence of having monopolized those resources, like I said, they can get people to fight each other who have all of the interest as neighbors to work together, but instead they're like in a state of fear, scarcity. You're more inclined to be afraid or hate your neighbor or blame the other who maybe doesn't sound or speak like you or look like you, and be induced to fight each other. And that's sort of one of the techniques of global empire today and into the past. Creation of scarcity.
It's an interesting critique of society that needs to be explored a little bit more. I want to sort of get you into the title of this channel. I put the rise of the predictive modeling mafia.
Yeah.
And we touched on this a little bit, maybe get into the details of this. In your article, you mentioned the Monte Carlo simulation. Now, for those who don't know what it is. Students of statistics who know Monte Carlo. Essentially, it is trying to get expected values from random distributions. You're trying to predict the random, future variable. You've got a distribution which is random, and what is the next random value going to be? And that's sort of Monte Carlo. There's no real definition for it. It works on stochastic processes. Stochastic is just another way for random. So it's all probability. And you showed a few examples, notably Neil Ferguson at Imperial College example, Ross McKittrick and Stephen McIntyre. And I know McIntyre a little bit. This model on debunking of the hockey stick in climate science. But you actually showed that this goes much deeper than just those two examples, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, this idea is not without its use. I'm not trying to say that Monte Carlo analysis should never be utilized, but you always want to know what the tool is that you're using in analysis and not become confounded, as so many have been led to believe, that the tool is more than it is or does more than it does. And that's the problem today. Monte Carlo itself, the name derives from the 1940s when an associate of John von Neumann, an information theorist,
mathematician, polymath,
yeah, he he was basically he loved gambling, and there was a particular casino in Monaco that he just, or is it Morocco now? I'm forgetting. Might have been Morocco.
Monaco, yeah, Monte Carlo, yeah.
Okay, there we go. So he was just really addicted to craps and roulette, and it was called the Monte Carlo Casino. And so they took that name. They're like, well, how about let's use this as a way of building models of the entire universe, presuming that casino function of that stochastic random, rolling of dice and roulette tables. We'll just presume that is the underlying mechanism that defines the behavior of every possible system that could be conceptualized in the universe and they didn't waste any time before they tried to start talking about utilizing this to chart and model solar systems, galaxies, human economies, cellular biology. So back in the 70s, there was a big information theory takeover of even health science and cellular biology.
And you make the point that some of these applications might be legitimate. It is when it comes to the social sciences when it's really concerning.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's a use, but never think that the key to understanding the essence or principle of causation of a thing that you're trying to figure out is located in a random a randomization tool,
right.
Which because the whole question is, how do we know the future, right? Animals kind of adapt to the moment, they adapt to the situation that they find themselves, but they don't develop concepts based upon future states and act preventatively for those future states. Humans can do that, and when we do that responsibly, we save lives. That's why, for a long time, periodic droughts would kill a lot of people until somebody was like, how about we put aside a portion of each harvest into a reserve, so when we do get hit, we won't have mass death. That worked nicely. That's acting on the future. Now, again, these Malthusians wish to do what Malthus did, which was he used a mathematical formula that he said this solves all the problems, which is that he observed that, food production grows in general according to an arithmetic ratio of growth, while human population growth patterns tend to follow a more geometric growth function. And so when you just chart these out, arithmetic's more linear, geometric is not really quite so linear. It's more of a exponential curve almost. You could predict, even if it seems like we have a lot of space, that within a certain amount of time, based on certain measurable features of arable land, mouths to feed, things like that, the social engineers could responsibly forecast where population will exceed ability to support those people, and you could make predictive or preventative killings, as Malthus in his first edition of his essays on population openly states. It's not me slandering Malthus. He says and describes how we can encourage the return of the plague, discourage well-meaning doctors who try to solve cures for ailments but are just causing more problems by inducing overpopulation. He calls for stopping parish assistance to families that have more than one kid above their license. He proposes all of these things. And they do it. They do it in the repeal of the Corn Laws in Ireland that resulted in over 1 million deaths. They did it in India on multiple occasions, over 24 famines that the British oversaw. A lot of this was informed by a British Malthusian calculus, a scientific diminishing of the population under controlled famines. That didn't happen.
Basically they projected the morality into the model predictions. Well, they used that to justify the morality, the two flow together. And I looked at stats the other day of Ireland. Ireland is the only country to have had a higher population in 1850 than today. Because
That's crazy.
Of the famine. So it was worse than Stalin's Holodomor, which was caused by Yasenkoism, which was something similar. So it's very, very, very dodgy stuff that's going on over there. And you make the point, so sort of in the article, that we shouldn't think that this stopped with Thomas Malthus. Okay, no. This stuff is going on, and these guys in these institutions and stuff, they think they have the model for the future, and it's getting out of hand, basically.
Yeah, and that's part of what. So even though the world, like Thomas Malthus, fell out of favor by the end of the 19th century because people began to realize that when we do things in a different way, when we think about the future, and as I begin my article with a quote by Lincoln, the best way to forecast the future is to create it. When you utilize responsible statecraft tied to the idea of improving the conditions of life of the people as well as their liberty, you can use state power, so national power as Lincoln used, but without destroying the freedom and the standards of living of the individual citizens who make up the government. You can actually increase free enterprise at the same time as you utilize national power. That resolves a freedom law contradiction, which a lot of people, both on the Keynesian end of the spectrum of who advocate top-down central planning, and the opposing, von Hayek Austrian school of neo-Adam Smithites, who say all central planning leads to feudalism and thus bad. Neither one is making any attempt to resolve what Lincoln resolved, and also various other statesmen, many of whom were assassinated by the 1880s, 1890s, all the way up to the Archduke. There was an understanding that there's a science of physical economy, but that is based upon a respect for the creative freedom and the dignity of the individual, the sacredness of the lives of the people, as well as an actual science to it as well. So you both have the flexibility of free will, a spontaneity quality that you have to have, as well as a harmonization with a concept of law. Again, these are concepts which students are processed through years of university and philosophy, and they come out of it more confused than they were when they went in.
Yeah, I can imagine. So luckily I did engineering, so I didn't have to go through that. But by the way, there's another constraint to that
sure.
Dimension to that needs to be said. And the Japanese tend to look at the history of the Industrial Revolution, the overcoming of Malthusian thinking, as the search for energy, in particular low entropy energy, coal and energy that is controlled gas, things of that sort, nuclear power. So their argument is that Malthusian constraints are overcome as long as you have the energy in the system, because energy being the capacity of work, and that is still regulated by the second law of thermodynamics. But of course, energy is infinite, and that is basically what can keep the economy going. So resources is not the constraint. The constraint is the availability of energy. So as long as you keep on developing your energy sources, you should be fine. And that, of course, speaks to the creativity and the markets and things of that. So they sort of intertwines into each other.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the development of some of these pseudoscientific doctrines when you trace them, their origins and deployment, the effects that they were intended to create on behalf of an agency of political oligarchical power in opposition to this other creative impulse within the species that were targeted for being undermined, which is the case in Ireland or in India or in pretty much anything bad we can imagine. you could generally find throughout the last 200 years that agenda undermining it. There is a tendency of, I think, trying to take useful things like empiricism. Empiricism is a useful thing, right? That the charting of sensory data, finding ways of graphing sensory data, which can be measured, smelled. There's a whole infinite array of ways to chart and model our data from our senses. Sometimes you pick up a pattern, right? Your senses see that the day the sun comes back, periodically. You look for patterns and you try to extrapolate patterns to find holes that your mind will never be, like your senses will never experience every possible day that could ever exist. You have an idea of day and an idea of night. But, we try to get a grasp of universals. Now, here's the change, no change problem, right? Because at some point there was no planet Earth. There was no like day, night, 24-hour cycle as we know it. But so there's a usefulness, but it's limited. The irresponsible thing that happens with the Monte Carlo statisticians, right, who believe in randomness being a responsible starting point to start mapping an idea of the whole or the future that is beyond the limits of the senses. Same problem happens with the senses themselves, where it's like people say, because I can't see every human being that's ever been and ever will be, the idea of humanity is an absurdity. That's what Bertrand Russell even said. The neo-positivist Bertrand Russell even said, the idea of humanity is an absurdity. All you can know ultimately is that which you see and taste immediately in your surroundings. And so it brings you into philosophical nihilism, relativism to an absurd degree. And at which point, well, what becomes true is really that which has the ability to impose their will. Those forces who have the power to impose their will onto the definitions and the norms and standards of a system, whatever that may be, is what then gets wins the label of truth in that great game. It doesn't mean that they believe in truth.
It's also they who select what is being measured, what is being censored or censused, on the census form. I mean, right. A good example of this is the classification of race in the United States and South Africa, which has gone to the point of absurdity. There is no way to box people into different races. The system in South Africa has always been abused, is abused to this very day because there's nuance between black, white, colored, Indian. And we don't even know how to classify the Asians that live there, for example. But yet that paradigm continues, yet we measure that. The government has stated clearly we measure it, but it's never going to influence policy. And yet that's absurd because that becomes a policy outcome at the end of the day. And you can do that experiment for carbon dioxide. You can do it for any metric that you wish. It doesn't matter, how you do it, whether it's tall people, young people, depends on what you want to impose onto it. So as long as you measure, you can put a model next to it and you say, aha, based on this model, based on this data set, that is the expected future that's going to come out of this. And I think that is sort of the flawed thinking in all of this.
No, man, you got it exactly. It's because whoever has the power, like you said, they can control what data is accepted and what data is rejected when we then make our official authoritative constructs or models that will determine what policy is going to be on a military level, on a climate level, on a pandemic response level, whatever, economic. How do you treat an economic forecast, right? Do you lower interest rates? Do you do a money tightening policy? Do you print money to stimulate the economy? Do you bail out the banks? Like all of these things that affect billions and billions of lives on the earth are made according to standards and criteria. Are those, and unfortunately in the past 40 plus years of the information economy, the post-industrial economy that I try to outline briefly in the essay that we're talking about, it increasingly is detached from considerations of actual principles of causation.
I found that so interesting. And you introduced a term here which was new to me, world problematic. Maybe you should explain that.
Well, that's sort of the poison seed out of which grew the later Club of Rome doctrine, and also Club of Rome. They were brought immediately into the early Davos World Economic Forum as well as MIT. Their practices were at the heart of the limits to growth models that were published by Donella Meadows, and Jay Forrester. That basically were the first to sort of chart all of these economic variables, as like including things like all of the stuff that Malthus was talking about 200 years earlier. They did it again, but now they said with our economic power, our computer modeling power that we now have that Malthus didn't. Now we can input more data and chart at what point we will have too many people under a more scientific way of
Okay,
thinking.
so the problem wasn't that Malthus was flawed in his methodology and thinking and his hypothesis or his assumptions. The problem was that Malthus didn't have enough data.
He didn't have enough data. He didn't have enough computer processing power. That's really their argument. And yeah, and they were the first ones also to then begin to say, and Alexander King, writing of the first 20 years of the Club of Rome, even admits, when trying to come up with the new priorities for our computer models, we had to think, well, like, what was going to fit the bill? Would it be associating industrial activity with the changing climate? How about weather in general? What would we do? And they were like, in the final analysis, we realized that the problem is human beings, because if there weren't human beings, we wouldn't have all of these other problems of pollution and everything else. So that's really the big problem, is how do we solve human beings? Which are like, whoa, at that point you're stepping
I
out
want
of
to
it.
read a text here from the Club of Rome's
Sure.
book, The First Global Revolution. I also mentioned in my article about COP27 and its origins, and it's like, it says, in searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it's only through changed attitudes and behavior that it can be overcome. The real enemy then is humanity itself. Now, what a wonderful thesis. The problems of the world is caused by human beings, and therefore the wise elites are going to dream up problems and solutions and ways that we need to change our ugly behavior to solve the problems of the world. I mean, that sounds like an amazing proposition.
Bless him, right? It's what a wonderful priest, and he does see himself. These groups do see themselves as high priests, but that does get at the question of world problematic that you were raising. Like, the essence of world problematic is located in that simple revelation that he shares with us, which is it emerged in his circles. It is associated to this day that whenever I look into it, its origins with the Club of Rome's founders, who are all playing with this idea of a new science of problems, of world problems. That's basically, problématique is the French word for problems, right? So world problems. So most sciences, I think, to be qualified as a science, I would say it should be solving some problem. Now, this is a different kind of science that's designed on listing and finding as many problems that were caused by human beings trying to solve problems. And so it was really a masturbatory way of using your time as an aristocrat and an oligarchist, where they would basically say, okay, in this example, human beings tried to find a cure for malaria by developing something like DDT, which caused mosquitoes to no longer circulate malaria in a certain target area of Sri Lanka. However, the problem is now we had overpopulation, new problems. So we solved the problem. Now we got rid of malaria, but now we have too many people. Or, green revolution stuff. They'll be like, okay, look, we solved these problems with golden rice and other forms of things that allow for rice to grow in hostile temperatures, but now there's too many mouths to feed. And so you could do this for anything. Anytime human beings intervene on nature with a new discovery, new problems arise, and you could then take one of two choices in your attitude to that reality, that fact of life. Either, great, more opportunities for more creative problem solving, or how do we stop the thing that caused those more problems, which is creative thinkers trying to solve problems. Like Malthus said, some well-meaning doctors in 1799, he's writing that some well-meaning doctors are too governed by their emotions and try to solve problems and cure illnesses, but in reality, those illnesses are given to us by God for a reason, to cull the human herd. And they're actually going against nature by curing those natural diseases. So when people,
what I find interesting, and this is probably true of elites throughout history, they never apply these solutions to themselves. They always look at the herd. They are their shepherds, and these are the people, and they've got this problem. You say malaria. The peasants are dying of malaria, so we need to find DDT. DDT is poisoning the environment. That's probably the peasants' fault, so we need fewer peasants. It's sort of, that's the thing. But they will never say we are the problem. No. And more importantly, it's also, this is a great quote from F.A. Hayek, and I can't remember the exact phrase, but it goes something along of, engineers love solving problems that are solving themselves. And I get the impression this is what these guys are doing. These are non-problems to begin with. that they are just dreaming up solutions for at times.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, like, and I found a quote, because this grouping of the Club of Rome had a Canadian branch as well. People like Maurice Strong, who's could be considered the godfather of the modern Great Reset. And I wrote an article, actually.
He founded the IPCC, basically, with Bert Berlin, who was the Swedish guy, right?
Yeah. He was somebody who was a Rockefeller operative. He was brought into Standard Oil when he was very young, in his 20s, as a Canadian. You know, he had some interesting family connections as well, which is his grandmother seems to have been married to a Rockefeller, which is weird. And his uncle was the president of the International YMCA, which played a very interesting role during the Cold War as far as espionage is concerned, but that's a whole other thing. His aunt Anna Strong was actually a confidant of Mao Zedong, and I think
there you go. Well, good connections. It's always
quite a few family connections, right? So he was already on a. People wonder, like, how did this young guy from Saskatchewan end up working for the Hudson Bay Company and then get recruited by Rockefeller, and then by the age of 28 became the CEO of like several oil companies, and then became the vice president of Power Corporation, and then he was on the selection committee that picked out.
It's obviously because of hard work and honesty, and
yeah, obviously he was just that. Yeah, exactly. No, so there's obviously something else as far as what animates this guy, and he was a co-founder, a leading player within the Canadian branch of the Club of Rome, also internationally, as you pointed out, IPCC founder, yada yada yada. He did a lot. Very hyperactive guy. Also, Klaus Schwab even says that he was his mentor, and he co-founded the World Economic Forum in 1971 too. But another thing to check on the list.
That's just a coincidence. I mean,
yeah, no connection. So Maurice Strong works with a bunch of sociopathic technocrats, and Maurice Strong, he's just at the Rio conference in Brazil in 1992. He poses, he says here, and this will sound very familiar from those who are watching the World Economic Forum policy today, and I cite this in my paper. Industrialized countries have developed and benefited from the unsustainable patterns of production and consumption, which have produced our present dilemma. And again, the present dilemma is a non-existent dilemma. It's like he's talking about, how do you stop man-made global warming, which itself is premised around, as we talked about, the selection of choice data sets that ignore all of the data sets that prove our climate models are wrong. So we've argued,
and it gets worse than that. And I had a message exchange with Stephen McIntyre today on this on Twitter. Even I've been communicating on this. It's much worse. The proxy rate data sets, according to the database that the IPCC uses to extract their proxies, that entire study says that these things are inconclusive. You can't conclude anything from them. There's a few proxies you can. The IPCC obviously choose the proxies that give them the hockey stick. So there's a pre-selection screening process going on before they even get there. And then even worse, as you point out in your article, the algorithm they use will always give them a proxy, a hockey stick, even if they put red noise into it. Okay, which is a noise without any trend. So the thing is just, it's a foregone conclusion. It doesn't even matter what the science is. The conclusion is there. It doesn't matter if global warming is real. So, and then obviously, to get further in, and this is where the Schwabs and the Maurice Strongs of the world comes in. They're obviously using this for political purposes. It's got nothing to do with reducing our emissions or anything of this sort of global warming. It's everything to do with them imposing their own policies. And it seems to me, at the end of the day, it's a resource grab. Coming back to the original point. Yeah,
they don't believe. It's like, do the Malthusians believe in Malthusianism? Did they ever? No, I don't think so. I think they always kind of knew that Malthus tried to remove the intelligibility of scientific and technological progress and creativity from the system in order to justify exactly the political effects they wanted to get back in the 19th century. And just like that today, I mean, do those who are promoting so religiously these climate models, do they believe in the 2050 Armageddon that we're going to create for ourselves by having, caused
or they get somebody who does believe in it to give them the prediction, but they don't,
No, exactly. They use useful idiots, but they're in the midst of buying oceanfront properties in the Bahamas, which, according to those models that they're putting all of their billions of resources into promoting, say will be underwater within a decade anyway. So why are you buying all these oceanfront properties?
They have insurance risk, I think.
Yeah. No, they don't care, right? So it's really, at the end of the day, it's not a scientific argument. When people say the science is settled, it's never been about science. It's a political argument over what type of operating system are we going to allow govern the currently collapsing order. Like the system that was put online under the helm of trilateral commission psychopaths like Kissinger, George Shultz, David Rockefeller, back when they were taking over the US administration, and bringing on this neo-Malthusian agenda, and justified by the Club of Rome modeling and things that gave it a scientific veneer. Well, they created a sleight of hand. They said, okay, the economy is no longer premised as we once thought with the old obsolete wisdom. It's no longer premised around industrial production or creation or the long-term thinking. Those are obsolete ideas. The new wisdom, you see, is, and then they say, okay, it's this. What do? We can have a consumer society cult. That why they didn't call it a cult. I'm calling it a cult. But basically, we can make money off of exporting our industrial base to poor countries, which will become slave labor markets that will do work, for a fraction of the cost that a high-paid laborer once did in Canada or New York or Philadelphia or Detroit. They will now do the work in Mexico or China or whatever. They will stay really poor using older technologies. They'll ship it back to us to consume. And we will now be in the post-industrial age, is what the 70s were sold as. So that no more dirty industries. Now we're in the ideas age.
And you know what's interesting on this? The critiques against this thinking, again, I point to the Japanese economists who actually do physics as well. They make the argument, and I come back to the energy question, that all of this wealth we have in Western countries, with lots of it's been moved to China, predicates on the availability of energy. And we have the cheap goods because of the energy being consumed in China, because the second law of thermodynamics has to hold. That's the way they look at it. And I think they've got every reason to look at it that way. Now, you cited in your article, and this was tragic when I read it, that Jimmy Carter, based on a Monte Carlo simulation, basically defunded the US government's nuclear program, the development of nuclear technology, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the stuff, the Monte Carlo analysis, you got to keep in mind, it grew, its incubation, its incubator was Rand Corporation and the US Navy. Those were the two sort of incubators for it. People like James Schlesinger were high-level Rand Corporation operatives who then later on governed Jimmy Carter's energy policy. He was also somebody who was a very high-level top dog within the CIA for a period too, during a time in the 60s where they purged U.S.
Rand Corporation published that dodgy study on how to destroy Russia just before the Russia-Ukraine war. Be a coincidence, obviously.
There's nothing that Rand didn't contaminate. I mean, every branch, it's incredible to look at the power and influence of Rand Corp it's not just some like think tank. It is really like the driving force of the worst perverted type of creative thinking and computer modeling, utilizing these core rotten assumptions throughout the 1940s when it was created, 50s, 60s, 70s. And a lot of their operatives it was like a finishing school for a lot of these cyberneticists and information theorists who saw the new way of bringing back as a lot of the, oh God, I don't want to open up too many doors, segues here. But look, the science of eugenics, as far as a neo-Malthusian, neo-Darwinian system of centralized scientific purifying of the human gene pool and the weeding out of the unfit, which people can now, I think, increasingly see has actually never really gone away.
That was, to me, I would say the biggest shocker since, I would say, COVID. I mean, I was aware of some of this stuff beforehand, but COVID was really, my, almost could say, nervous breakdown into realizing what's going on with deep politics and structures. And I spoke to James Corbett about this last year or so, and I'm still not entirely in agreement with him. But I thought, as a student of history, as a student of propaganda, that eugenics was entirely discredited with the Holocaust. I'm not so sure about that anymore when I read transhumanism and all this stuff. I'm still not 100% sure it's not been discredited, because even some of those guys like Gates and them have at least moved away from some of the arguments. But it seems to me that there's a certain core of obsession with genes, especially, that has stayed alive. And it's as if these guys continue with this.
Yeah, they have. And I, just as a side note, I also had a nervous breakdown about 20 years ago when I began to also like some people could just like take some of this stuff and kind of like put it in the trivia box in their head and live their dual life, saying, you know, with this weird dichotomization, like, yeah, 9/11 was actually this very other thing, organized by forces that have taken over my government over generations. And then I'm living my life and having this dual identity. And some people can do that. I couldn't do that.
Right. No, I hear you. It's I don't want to open that door as well. I have, but I would rather close it
that's for another future. That was for me, my personal experience there with that discussion.
Yeah.
But all that to say, it's natural, like, you know, and so today, like, the issue of like Rancor is really what I wanted to get at. So the way that they were able to transmit eugenics after Hitler made it look so obviously bad, you know, like it was already growing. Rockefeller Foundation, the Macy Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, others were huge sponsors of this stuff. They had 30 states in the United States by 1934 that had passed sterilization laws.
Well, what is never said, and I touched a bit of this on my article on COPE, is the first genocide of the last century wasn't the Third Reich. Okay, it wasn't even the Armenian genocide that happened in Namibia, which was predicated on eugenics, the Second Reich. And the thinking within colonial Africa was entirely eugenics. It was born and bred in South Africa as well, and in through the British Empire and the German Empire, for that matter. The British were no exception to this. That type of thinking. I mean, it's the thinking of domination and control at the end of the day, and that came back to Europe later on. And it's for some reason we never opened the origin of these ideas, you know. And I think that sort of has to be part of this as well.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, here's the thing. We might even want to do a follow-up conversation because the origins of eugenics and the fallacy of Darwinian methods of trying to explain the evolution of species is a whole other discussion. But I will say this: there is a direct continuity between the false theories of Malthus and Malthus's theories of how healthy systems are designed to function to Darwin, who openly read Malthus's essays on population and admits in his autobiography that it was only by reading that and appreciating the struggle for survival in a closed system of diminishing returns. I'm paraphrasing so loosely here. This is almost exactly what he says, that I finally had a mechanism by which to work to construct his explanation amongst the various other explanations that were already existing in his contemporary world to explain the existence of fossils and the obvious existence of a certain orientation of living organisms, some disappearing, some coming online, and the lack of continuous gradualism in the fossil records. We tend to find these discontinuous leaps almost from system to system. And so in the Darwinian approach, he is using a Malthusian way of thinking to explain something that's applicable to the evolution of all species in the race for diminishing returns. Again, presuming that closed systems are a force of nature. I've not seen any actual scientific evidence that closed systems are the fundamental force of nature. In there, I don't see that. But he did, and then his cousin Galton extended that or extrapolated that to human systems. And people who say, oh, but that was Galton, you can't blame Darwin for what his cousin did. It's like, well, he wrote to Galton saying, you have made a convert out of me. I am now your disciple. He says that. So I'm sorry. And then you had this like fake dispute between Galton and Herbert Spencer, who coins the term social Darwinism, which is appreciated by a lot of
well, even the guys of the ecosystem. I mean, the particular South Africa, where Jan Smuts, who was the founder of the League of Nations, he coined the idea of this. Was the Prime Minister of South Africa at the time. He abused the idea of the ecosystem to say everything is a natural order. Now you can see how that comes into the apartheid regime being justified. I mean, that's very, so what they do, these guys, and I think that sort of ties in even with the predictive modeling and everything, is that they take ideas that are legitimate in, say, the hard sciences or in mathematics, and then they try and apply it to the social sciences. And, I mean, evolutionary theory explains nature, it explains how species develops, all of these things. But then to try and make a social policy out of that, you can easily see how it gets to eugenics. If you take the ecosystem, you can easily see how you get ecosystem. You can easily see how you can get to the apartheid regime. So this is sort of how they do it. And what you have just highlighted, I think, very well in your piece is mathematical models are being abused in the exact same way, and to this very day, and this problematic type of thing.
Yeah. Well, and the point with Rand that I was trying to get. So when eugenics really, it became clear and people could see the consequence of what happens when you have a real sort of transhuman. And I mean, Nazism, the Nazi fascist ideology was really, you could see it as a proto transhumanist agenda, in the sense that you dichotomized the system the way Hobbes did earlier around master-slave relations. The superior blood is born into the master stock, the inferior into the slave peasant feudal stock, talking human cows. And, Hitler basically had a bit of a neo-Darwinian, Nietzschean view of the Übermensch and the Untermensch. And the Übermensch is the more than human, the Untermensch is the less than human, that you could define. And the Übermensch, which he saw his stock as the blonde-haired, blue-eyed figure that he obviously was, right? Hitler. He basically saw the idea that, well, the more than humans have to determine this scientific management, the levers of breeding and of expelling the unwanted genetic stock from the Unter people. The transhumanist ideology is based on the same idea that, well, like when you listen to Yuval Harari talking about how natural selection has been random for all of human history up until now, where he says at Davos 2 years ago that we now have a form of real natural selection for the first time, but the natural selectors are those of us here in the crowd who are the CEOs of Facebook and of Google and of the... And it's like, well, how do you see yourself then? You see yourself, like you just said, as not the part of the system that you're talking about. You're something outside of the system with your God complex, professing the right to then judge the rest of humanity, who will be the useless eaters of tomorrow, who we can pacify with video games and drugs.
And UBI, universal basic income. That's the next one that's on the list. But it's sort of, I mean, I spoke to Joel Kotkin about this, who wrote the book The Coming of New Feudalism, and he's probably not going to be as deep into this as you and I, but he made the argument that these guys are like the old feudal lords, so the old aristocracy. They were the aristocracy at that time were enormously stupid during Middle Ages times. They got inherited wealth, and actually, if you look at wealth in Europe today, a lot of it is based on inheritance. Even if you follow Piketty, for example, in his economic analysis, we don't live in a much different system than that times. And at the end of the day, the aristocracy dug their own grave in medieval times because of this stuff. They believed this nonsense, and eventually they were swamped by, the peasants. It's sort of like you'd think these guys would know a little bit of history, but the tragedy is I don't think they know anything.
No, the lies we tell ourselves are very strong, and the lies that you tell yourself if you're enmeshed in a system like they are, that it's so ingrained, it's so deeply rooted in the fabric of history, this oligarchical parasitical system that has maintained continuity, that has refined its techniques of grooming its own, of undermining the creative and psychospiritual potentials of its victim target slave society that it wants to undermine, or at least induce to undermine ourselves, right? Because that's the thing in a world where people have a taste of freedom, you have to get them to love their shackles. And folks like Aldous Huxley, who worked very closely, people say, oh, he was different than his brother Julian, the president of the British Eugenics Society. He was different. It's like, no, they had different assignments to carry out the same effect. One was just more focused on predictive programming. But if you look at everything Aldous actually did, including reading his Brave New World Revisited 10 years later, and his championing of the growth of the military-industrial complexes and MKUltra's LSD-25 experiments, and how they could retool the fabric of human civilization in a way that would allow for the deconstruction, depatternization of the ancient traditions that had animated human society over religious, familial, national traditions, depattern us, especially focusing on the new generation born after World War II, which was the target. They were looking at a whole generation. They weren't looking at individuals anymore.
It was a grand idea based on a grand social engineering experiment, basically. That his ideas was part of a. It's not just his own ideas; it was part of the elite opinion at the time.
He was a high-level priest of this, but it was part. He had an assignment to play, and he played it well. He recruited people like Timothy Leary, and together, they write. And Timothy Leary actually documents how he was recruited to this thing, and how he and Aldous recognized the true enemy being the value system of Christianity and the need to create a new scientific paganism, a humanistic paganism for the new world order. They talk about that. And like I was going to say with Rand Corporation, because that's the key with the trilateral takeover of America, you have to look at cybernetics. So the choice used to be the conduit that would bring in the science of eugenics, the fascist eugenics program under new wineskins, but really with the same poison wine, took the form of cybernetics, which is what Norbert Wiener, a mathematician and a bit of a radar operator or somebody who worked on radar programming in World War II. He was a student of Bertrand Russell, and he took it upon himself to carry out an assignment, as well as he was a student of Russell at Cambridge in 1913, to actualize to make applied the pure study of a cosmology that Russell and Whitehead had formulated in their 3-volume Principia Scientifica, which attempted to sort of reduce the entire universe and all intelligibility, all ponderable thought and existence to a limited set of axioms and postulates, the way kind of Euclid done or Newton had attempted. They wanted to basically do the same thing, but now with the problematic consequences of general relativity, quantum mechanics, the new insights into electromagnetism and radiation that Madame Curie and others had innovated. None of that. It was all sort of proving where the cracks were in the Newtonian fabric, right? And so they're like, well, we have to do a fix. And so they attempted to take all that new data, plug it back into a closed system. Now, the problem with that is, as we know, there's many problems, but number one, the universe doesn't actually seem to be a mathematically, it has similarity in some ways to mathematical ideals and geometric constructs we can imagine in our minds in an ideal ivory tower, but it has a lot of divergences. There's a nonlinearity in the universe as well that allows for this non-perfect mapping. It breaks when you try to map our linear mathematics.
Well, the way I look at it, and to make it more simple, I take Thomas Sowell's critique of many of these ideas, where he said the intellectuals, or the elites is probably a better term in our time here, have an inability to see a system of shared intelligence, which means that they are one node among many forms of intelligence. And they always have the idea that my model, my prediction, my conception of the world is the correct one. And that's sort of, I think, the bigger critique against all this stuff, why that can't work, I think, ultimately. I just want to sort of, in last few minutes, just highlight two...
Oh, wait, before you do that, so just to finish my thought, and then I'll let you do it.
Yeah, sure.
Cybernetics was the tool. So Norbert Wiener developed cybernetics as a system of control. It was a science of controls, with the idea that you could bureaucratize any system as a system such that only a certain limited group of those in the know, in the helmsman position, in the sort of the nervous center, would be allowed to see what the whole was. But everybody in the hyper-bureaucratized system would not be able to see what's outside of their department. And that was done to NATO, it was done to the OECD, it was done to the US military, and it was done to the education system. And this was very much so done, which allowed for
the compartmentalization of knowledge, basically.
Compartmental, but also in practical terms, in terms of the bureaucracies of the system of management structures that Rand Corp, because how do they affect this think tank? Every single field of policymaking, military and other, economic. So all of these things received the treatment. In Canada, it was the Privy Council Office under Pierre Elliott Trudeau that received a cybernetics overhaul. It was really a cybernetics revolution under Carter as well. Similar sorts of things were applied under and it wasn't Carter. The guy he didn't know what the hell he was doing half the time. But you had people like James Schlesinger, you had Paul Volcker and others doing the same thing in every level. And you had operatives throughout the European Union doing the same thing, all to create a conduit where the revival of what then became known as transhumanism. Again, Julian Huxley, president of Eugenics Society, is founding the transhumanist sect as a new like religion for the elite, while you have like watered down versions of it.
Do you think the guys who is this maybe a question? These guys eventually come to believe in their own propaganda, or do you think they actually see it just as noble lies being sold to a managerial class?
No, I think over time they start believing it, and the older generation that was smarter, that knew it was a lie, they die, and the younger generations start believing in their own illusions. Yeah, and I think that that's their biggest Achilles heel.
So I just want to highlight two things from your article that I found quite important. It's quite close to my things I sort of care more about, is how the funding for nuclear, we talked a little bit about this, energy was cut, and how manufacturing was outsourced based on this type of thinking.
Yeah.
And can you maybe just sort of re-highlight how that happened?
Okay. Well, the logic was that because you couldn't forecast in any of those linear economic models that extrapolated present trends into the future as the sole technique with certain stochastic underlying assumptions built into the models, because you couldn't forecast how or when qualitative new discoveries would be made, like, for example, in fusion power development or next generation closing of the nuclear fuel cycle, which would have allowed for us, and we came very close in the 70s under Carter, and it was all canceled. We came so close to not having to bury nuclear waste underground. You could reprocess nuclear waste. That's what pebble bed nuclear reactors do, third, fourth generation.
Yeah. Chinese just started a pebble bed yesterday, by the way.
Where is that?
China. And they based it on... Yeah, and the pebble bed design, Germans design, most of the R&D was done in South Africa with US help, US South African Corporation. Coal lobby in South Africa convinced the government to get rid of the funding. Chinese buys the technology and they're doing it. Great stuff, So
here's the thing. China doesn't actually govern, they don't limit themselves to these types of linear models the way we have. They've got problems, but they don't have problems there. They're committed, and that's why they've been able to do things that we were close to doing. And they've pioneered and gone far beyond with magnetic levitation trains. They're going for molten salt thorium reactors. They've put their eggs in every single approach to fusion development you can imagine. They didn't just put it all into like one tokamak wind egg.
I come back to my point I highlighted earlier. Why? The Asian leadership see the history of the Industrial Revolution as a search for energy.
Yeah.
They don't see it as markets and the trade and things like that. And that's been the fundamental mistake in the West.
Exactly.
I think they've got it right.
Yes. Yeah, they're looking at it from the standpoint of the energy of the system and what is needed to sustain the material requirements of the individuals within the system on a per capita and per square kilometer basis overall. They're thinking on those types of volume terms, while we are thinking in a much more low-level, myopic, bottom-up, like individual, individual.
I have to ask you this one, but somebody's asking, aren't they buying gold? Has gold got anything to do with this? I don't think so.
Well, yeah, they're de-dollarizing massively, and they are buying gold, but it's part of the oncoming tsunami. They're doing a variety of things on many levels to try to protect themselves from the consequence of the imminent systemic meltdown of the Western system that they have been enmeshed in for many decades. And so they're preparing for that tsunami. They're trying to protect their people and gearing up for that crash. They have given us many chances to work with them. South Africa might be in a better position than Canada in that sense, being part of the BRICS. Maybe you could break free.
No, our biggest trading partner is still collectively still the United States and Europe.
Yeah, but the U.S. Here's the thing: the U.S. is sitting on a bubble with nothing supporting it, and a death cult running it.
We don't have electricity, so it's South Africa's got electricity supply shortage. Our leaders also don't get it. And there's somebody else who says, yes, Chinese leaders have science degrees, ours are lawyers. That's part of the problem. They've got technical leaders. I mean, I'm not saying let's eliminate China by all means, but I'm saying let's at least get a little bit of that thinking back and get some jobs and energy and investment back into the West.
Oh, man, yeah. Exactly. Like it used to be normal. I read books about this before we were born. It was normal that if you wanted to be a minister of health or somebody in charge of energy policy, you were expected to have living experience as a doctor before you became an administrator, or an engineer before you became an administrator of engineers. Today, that's gone. That's long gone. Now you could just study management and all of a sudden find yourself overseeing a process you have no idea how to understand. at all.
Yeah, but this is part of the MBAization of the working environment as well. That, as you say, I mean, 40 years ago, there was a good article written by Daniel, I think it's Markowitz or something of the sort. He written How Mackenzie Killed America, something of the sort, and basically made the argument in 1950s, if you started a job, you would work yourself up to management. You would manage a company, even if you started a shop, or even if you had a degree, you would start as an engineer, but you'd get maybe CEO one day. Today, you go into top management with an MBA and then you become CEO. So that practical level of thinking goes away. And that's across the board. And I think it speaks to all of this. I mean, this problematic type of thing is how we train MBAs. It's how we train managers. And this is the consequence,
Right. And this gets back to the question that I didn't fully answer. So there's two aspects to the answer on the question of why is it that under Carter and this new type of mathematization of future forecasting, why did we cut off the real world need and the cutting edge discoveries we were making in fusion power, in nuclear power more generally, in large scale economic development, in mega projects that we were building in the 50s and 60s that we just stopped, hydroelectric dams, other things. We stopped all of that. Well, part of it was that the Malthusian ideologues wanted to justify, on the one hand, they were saying, okay, because you can't know what the consequence is going to be, we shouldn't do it. And because you can't know when the discovery is going to happen, because it's nonlinear discovery, we shouldn't do it. There's no point, as they say today in business courses, if you can't prove a monetary incentive within 3 years, a payback of an investment, it's not worth doing. They teach that crap in universities. If you can't prove monetary payback within 3 years, it's not worth doing. Nothing good ever came that was really, really good, at least after only 3 years. You have to think like 10, 15, 20, 30 years like JFK did. That's gone. But on the deeper level, as we were saying, they really wanted to basically say with this problematic thinking, if it's successful, we will have abundant energy that will cause a correlated spike, a growth in living standards, longevity, and quantity of people that could be then sustained in a nuclear-based society liberated from limits of coal and natural gas, which would be what happens the more you start utilizing nuclear power, the less you need forms of hydrocarbons. And when you get to fusion, holy shit. I mean, at that point, like one truckload of helium-3 from the moon is enough to sustain current. One truckload of helium-3 from the moon, of which there are millions of tons, as far as we know, could sustain Earth's needs at a very high standard for like a year. Like that's just another level. So
I worked on the fusion project at ITER. There's a lot of steps before we get there one day, but hopefully we'll get there one day.
You gotta think. Go aim for the stars. It might hit the moon, right? So, I mean, the point is they were looking at all of the dangerous consequences of overpopulation, as Alexander King admits to.
I show you just to get on the fusion one, I show you the stupidity of what is going on. To finish ITER, and ITER is a bad project in many ways because it's managed by multiple companies, but it's in south of France. Just to finish the project, to see if it can work, because we don't really know if that scale is going to work, but it's good plausibility for it to work scientifically. Would cost 3 weeks of military spending in Afghanistan. That's how much it costs. Just to test the technology. Now, if you're going to waste money on a war to chase a bunch of Afghans around for whatever reason, search Taliban where there is no Taliban, you might as well use that money to spend it on some scientific technology. But that's thinking, you say this problematic, the logical consequence of this has been that we come to this position when we say it is more lucrative to get money back spending it on a war than it is to invest it into the search for energy-dense solutions.
Yeah. Well, there's a guy named Maurice Lamontagne, who was a very powerful president of the Canadian Privy Council office, who I'm just going to creativeness. He had reformed. He brought cybernetics and the Club of Rome, actually systems analysis, into the governance of the practice, the development, and application of science in Canada from 1970 to 73 as a senator. He was a major handler of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and he writes in his third volume of the Canadian Science Policy Reports from the Senate that had a huge effect on everything. He says it directly, and I'm going to read this whole quote because I think it's just so important. Nature imposes definite, and this is a founder of the Club of Rome of Canada. Nature imposes definite constraints on technology itself, and if man persists in ignoring them, the net effect of his action in the long run can be to reduce rather than to increase nature's potential as a provider of resources and habitable space. But then an obvious question arises. This is the key. How can we stop man's creativeness? He's serious. But then he goes on, and he sounds like he's like, okay, but I admit we can't. He says, how can we proclaim a moratorium on technology? It's impossible to destroy existing knowledge, impossible to paralyze man's inborn desire to learn, to invent, and to innovate. So he acknowledges this inborn desire, right? This is what makes this slimy as hell. In the final analysis, we find that technology is merely a tool created by man in pursuit of his infinite aspirations and is not the significant element invading the natural environment. It is material growth itself that is the source of conflict between man and nature. This is key because he's like, some technologies are good, right? We just have to channel the values of the species into directions that have as an outcome the creation of technologies that as an effect of their application.
Solar and wind, there you go.
Solar and wind will reduce material growth potential, which then reduces the schism between human population and the limits of nature. So, and CGI, entertainment technologies, psychedelic drug tech, all these startup companies that are like developing new techniques for giving you a new type of ecstasy high, AI, all of this stuff, we'll call that fourth industrial revolution and social credit, all these things that involve technology and creativity that will reduce human beings potential. Will maybe even add things like reducing.
I've got this question for you then on this. Let's spend the next few minutes on this maybe, and then I'll really end this podcast. Isn't this just opening a door for fraudsters like, who's this SBM, Bankman-Fried, the guy from FTX? Isn't this just going to open doors for a bunch of fraudsters and hucksters to exploit the naivety of these people?
Yes. Yes.
That seems to be my conclusion as well. Like a lot of this stuff sounds good on paper, AI and psychedelics for everyone, and who knows whatever. But it seems to me at the end of the day, it becomes a grift. If you look through all of it,
it does, yeah. And that's where I have a certain amount of. That's what gives me heart and faith in this. Like, people ask me if I'm an optimist, and I say yes, I am. But I mean, and they're like, how can you be when you talk about all of these evil things you talk about, and you acknowledge that? And it's like, well, because I also know that they destroy themselves every time they come close to achieving what their goals are, and it's not a new thing. This whole restore feudalism using technology is not a new desire that they just came about with. This has been something that's been attempted many times throughout history. Whenever they come close to it, they usually do things that blow up in their face, and they undermine their own basis of existence, because even a parasite is generally not stupid enough to kill its own host. It knows enough just to keep the host alive, because if the host dies, you don't do well. So they're really a perversion of anything in nature that we see just be, anything in nature has a desire to survive, to thrive, and to harmonize. That's nature in general. There's obviously the wolves will fight, there will be bloodletting, but overall nature is organized in a harmonic way. When you try to extract the worst elements of nature, of the law of the jungle, and you put that onto human beings, it's even more unnatural. And you convince people that we're fish for only so long. At a certain point, we realize that there's something, this thing, oxygen, that we might actually want more than thinking we're fish underwater. So I think this is what we have now going now with this rupture.
But I think a lot of people have woken up to, I don't know if you should say woken up anymore, but are aware of this nonsense that's been going on. And I think a lot of critical questions are being asked. I mean, I'm reading your articles, I'm reading Whitney Webb, even stuff I've written. And what I like is that citizen journalists are coming back. There's a sense of you're not being paid. I mean, I've got a Substack account. I make a little bit of money out of it. I hope people subscribe to it, but not a lot. But I've got a job, and you write an article like this, and I think that collectively, that collective critique is eventually going to filter through and bring down this whole grift. Because I cannot see any of this crap, to be honest, to be long enduring.
No, I agree with you completely. I think ultimately truth is always going to win out at the end of the day. It doesn't mean that we are necessarily going to win this battle. I'm not trying to give people false hopes like some QAnon thing. There could be, and there probably will be, some serious challenges that are going to test our character going into the immediate future here. But in the broad fight, I do see this oligarchy as being completely self-sabotaging. They're undermining their own basis of existence. And I do think overall, like I saw somebody wrote in the live stream, the Sapphire project utilizing medium temperature fusion looks promising. Damn straight that looks promising. There's things like that happening with the Sapphire project being one of many different really creative, off the beaten path, but effective approaches to solving problems of fusion by just simply they just don't assume, the people working on this thing in Toronto and in the US, they just simply don't assume that every single element of standard model atomic physics is immutably true.
The thing is, we just need to throw some. I mean, this is, of course, we ask for the state to come in, because you don't need state money for a lot of the stuff. Private venture's not going to do it. But I think we just need to go back to a little bit of common sense politics. Forget about free markets everywhere. Forget about offshoring, crap like this. Just go back to saying, well, if the technology looks promising, let's put money into it and see where it goes. And then, acknowledge it will fail as well.
Exactly. No, exactly. And I do think overall, that a big chunk of the Eurasian nations right now are animated by a policy that doesn't want to sacrifice their people under this altar of this death cult. I do think that I do recognize that there is a fight within many of the Eurasian countries, India, China, Russia. I don't see them as simple monoliths that we've been told by the CIA that they're just like this one thing. I see fights going on. The difference there is I actually see nationalist forces who don't want to kill their people and want to revive something potent as having done a better job at battling their deep states than we have, which in our case, there's a lot less active resistance at this moment in history in the West than I see in the Eurasian zone, where the fight is a lot more vibrant.
Well, I'll put it to you this way. Look, on the African continent, we aren't developed yet in many countries. South Africa is a bit of an exception to that, but we also lack development in many areas. And if you look at the way the African elites talk about development, they're looking at the East at the moment. They're saying, the West has got great stuff, but look at the stuff that's going on with your elites. You're going nuts.
Yeah.
Right. So they look into Asia. And what's interesting is at the end of this century, 4 out of 10 people in the world will be African. Be interesting to see what growth projection Africa takes, because Africa's got internal conflicts. We've got lots of issues. I mean, it's not rosy by any means. And our path development won't be easy. But I see that way. I think it's just there is some choice now. I mean, there is no longer only the American empire. There is other choices to pick from, and I think over time the competition will win out. I'm a sort of believer in that type of thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I tend to think the same thing too. I mean, if we didn't have, I think the problem is cynicism. We've lived under a hypocritical, corrupt system for so long. You and I were born into such a warped system, and so many people were, that they don't even have a living reference point of what sanity should be on a policy level. So
it might just be that we've got more transparency than ever before. Maybe it was the way in the past. Read up about it.
You mean whether it was saner in the past, or whether it was as insane in the past as it is today?
No, I mean, I think this type of nonsense has always been going on. It's just people are more aware of it at the moment.
Yes and no. I mean, though, if you look at the greatest explosions of growth, of creative growth that happened, I mean, in recent history, you got to look at the period of Abraham Lincoln and the international network of statecraft that had activated a different policy in the late 19th century. You got to look at, there was, I mean, a huge fight to undermine the first and second and third attempts of the New World Order in the 20th century that goes back to the League of Nations in 1923, which was supposed to be the one world government final end of history thing back in 1923-24. I mean, the thing was put online in 1919. But you had a massive fight of high-level statesmen around Warren Harding in Canada and Ireland and in various parts of Europe who all said, no, they don't want to sacrifice themselves on this altar. You got another attempt at a new world order of eugenics, a new eugenics religion in 1933 under the London Bankers Conference that tried to give the solution to the Great Depression that they themselves had caused under that controlled demolition of 1929. And the London Bankers Conference was, again, give over all national sovereignty to the Bank of England and Bank of International Settlements, and everybody sign on to this suicide. didn't happen, but it only didn't happen because there was a massive fight by people around Franklin Roosevelt, people, mostly it was Americans at the time. And then again, you know, like, why didn't Hitler, though Hitler received so much support from the British and American fascist aristocracies, why did that get aborted instead? And, you know, so there were these different, more feudal, messed up futures that almost happened, which didn't, because of a fight of moral people who recognized that their lives were worth losing in order to defend humanity. So a lot of those stories have been brushed away or forgotten.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Sure. Where can people find you? Where can they find your work?
Okay. It's CanadianPatriot.org is a good place to start. My books, Clash of the Two Americas, Volume 1 to 3, and the Untold History of Canada book series are all easy to find on the CanadianPatriot.org. Also, RisingTideFoundation.net is a pretty good thing that I manage with my wife, who's a wonderful writer. She just wrote her first book as well, Cynthia Chung. So RisingTideFoundation.net, CanadianPatriot.org, and Substack. So MathewEhret.substack.com. You can sign on for free or get the paid upgrade. Sort of our bread and butter these days, right? So, yeah.
Okay. Well, Matthew, thank you very much for this conversation, and I really enjoyed it. And people, please read these articles in the description on the Club of Rome, the Predictive Mafia. It digs into a lot of this. There's a lot more to the story, as you can tell from the conversation. And yeah, thank you very much.
All right.